I think everyone just wants properly sited shelters. Properly sited shelters that have security, that can make sure that we have enough beds, and also get people the services they need, particularly the treatment, because these are low barrier shelters.
The words of Seattle City Council President Joy Hollingsworth this week as she discusses the challenges of finding sites for shelter units, as we explore what's next in an ambitious plan from Mayor Wilson's office to expand shelter capacity across the city. What's the council's take on this plan, and what is next in the goal to get to 500 units? Get them online by June. We'll have to see about that. Plus, as the council makes a request for a larger library levy that's going out to the voters, there's some mixed economic news for the city, including a bit less enthusiasm for the impact of some World Cup matches coming to Seattle in June. We'll have all these stories and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. And after a brief spring break for me, I am back with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I am not a philosopher, but I keep coming back to this existential question. Is sweeping the Houston Astros in a 4-game series a good feeling or an absolutely great feeling? What do you got?
Yeah, I think it's the best possible regular season outcome is to beat the Houston Astros in 4 games. So, short of the playoffs, it's about as good as it gets.
Yeah, and you don't always get those 4-game series, and the fact they took all of them, that was pretty awesome. So,
one of the baseball podcasts I listen to calls that a mop instead of a sweep.
I like it. Yeah, if you do more than 3, that sounds good to me. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you, David. Thanks to all of our patrons. And if you're not a patron, please become one and support the show. You get Patrons First podcast. We're going to hear one in just a matter of days, patrons. So thank you very much. Plus, you get a cool decal. Wouldn't that look nice on your laptop? Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's rock and or roll. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, over the past few weeks, we've been tracking this plan from Mayor Katie Wilson to add 500 more shelter units by June. Reports from council staff say that goal appears to be, quote, unrealistic. They're also concerned about the continued funding for these units as well, which of course includes social services. All that said, the council signed off on the mayor's legislation this week to help speed up construction, and I want to break down what the council is actually doing. It's 3 pieces of legislation. 1, to provide funding for the first 500 units with some existing unspent dollars within the city budget. 2, they want to speed up the leasing process so that the city's Finance and Administrative Services Department makes the deal first, then hands things off to a nonprofit partner, makes things go a lot quicker. And then 3, allowing for the expansion of existing shelter spots like tiny home villages to expand from 100 units to 150 and up to 250 in one location in each city council district. I think that's about it. How would you describe what the council is doing, and I guess if this is going to work?
Yeah, I think what the council is doing is, I think they understand that this is the mayor's number 1 agenda item, and I don't think they want to get in the way of new shelter. I think by passing, obviously the money is a big piece of this, and the fact that the mayor is asking for money ahead of the typical budget season
right,
and is getting it, I think is notable because that, the council kind of fiercely guards its budget negotiations and is often quite hesitant to earmark money before the kind of full conversation can be had because that's always a pretty intense negotiating process. So that's notable that they are willing to grant this money. And then, I think the leasing piece is important too. The mayor's office is saying the current process, which runs through the King County Regional Homelessness Authority and puts the onus on providers to find space and get it ready. They say that takes something like 12 to 15 months. They think that by giving the city the authority to find and lease that land directly, they can get that down to something like 3 to 5 months. So that would be significant if that actually is the case. I think the expansion piece, my sense is that still is in committee. I think that has to go a little bit more through the process. But, their thinking there is there are encampments and shelter sites that could get bigger, that the space could handle more, but they're not allowed to do that. It's a real step. The council at the same time is exercising its right and putting on new requirements around good neighbor agreements and public safety requirements, things like that. But, I think it is in some ways an endorsement of what is the top priority for Mayor Wilson.
Yeah, fair enough. I did hear Council President Hollingsworth say at her council huddle press conference this week that the council is supportive, generally, of the mayor's plan, as you're saying. But at the same time, and you wrote about this a little bit in the Seattle Times, there are some council members asking questions. We've seen a lot of these different amendments coming through, and there was just a bit of a piece with Councilmember Strauss I wanted to talk to you about, because he was talking with you about this need for even more service-intensive shelter units, which could add a lot of cost here. Can you talk about that and how that affects the cost of this project, and I guess just how many people it could potentially reach?
Yeah, and I don't think there's any sort of ideological or theoretical difference of opinion here between the council and the mayor's office on this. The mayor's office is saying we want this to be high acuity shelter. We want it to be able to handle some of the folks who need the most support.
Right.
You're right, though. That raises the question of just how much this is going to cost. And I think to Councilmember Strauss's point, I think his view is the lengths to which sort of low support tiny home villages that maybe just has an intake person, how far those can go to actually sort of addressing the real needs of the homeless population in Seattle has been kind of maxed out. He's saying that if you are somebody for whom that kind of low support model works, you're probably living in a place already.
Yeah, now they need more units with more services, it sounds like.
His point is, that a lot of the folks who are living in encampments have tried and perhaps been kicked out of some of those tiny home villages. And so in her quest to stand up 4,000 shelter units, Councilmember Strauss and others are just really hammering on the fact that these units have to come with the whole kitchen sink. It has to come with all of the support systems so that they can actually be successful in changing the reality of what it means to be sleeping outside in Seattle or just walking down the street in Seattle.
Yeah, maybe they've been through the whole shelter process before. So I just, bottom line for me, those are more expensive spaces and could affect the cost of this program.
Yeah, exactly. And Councilmember Strauss even said it in those terms. He said, I want the more expensive ones. Give me the more expensive ones. There are a few major questions tied to this push for 4,000 units. A big one is ongoing cost. She's getting some upfront money from the council, which I think is good to kind of get things moving. But that's not all it's going to be, because to have services at these places, it requires a significant annual investment.
Right.
And there is no plan for that right now. It's early to have
maybe
a
some
plan.
Philanthropy. I know she was talking about philanthropy too.
Yeah, she name-checked a few companies. We haven't gotten a lot of details on how involved those companies would be. Certainly that's interesting from the candidate who's ran as a socialist. But, I think I was also indicative of she is not particularly ideological so long as she feels like I think she will work with whomever will help her get to her goals. And that in this case includes business.
Yeah. We'll see what's happening next with that. Again, a lot unfolding with the council this week, but a lot happening over the next couple of months here. And I guess my bottom line on this, David, do you feel confident that 500 number can be reached by June? I mean, it's a bright line there, and I know the mayor's going to get some pushback on that.
No, I don't feel confident that it can be reached by June. And frankly, I don't think the mayor's office feels that confident they can get there by June. I talked to Wilson's chief of staff for our story, and she basically said, you know what, that's an ambitious goal. We always knew that was an ambitious goal. We know that's a stretch. I think they're sort of trying to reframe it a little bit. We're really focused on that 1,000. I think the 500 was to give themselves a bit of a kick in the butt to get going on it. But I'm not confident. The city council legislative staff is not confident. And I don't think the mayor's office is particularly confident that they can get to 500 by the World Cup.
Yeah, but
I think 1,000 is maybe still within reach by the end of the year.
Yeah, and setting up the structure, I think, is the main key point to this. At least that's what the mayor said to me on Seattle Channel recently. Thanks for that, David. Speaking of cost, the Seattle Library levy appears like it'll be about $70 million more than what the mayor asked for in her initial proposal of roughly $410 million. Full disclosure, Seattle Channel could stand to gain some funding for library programming in this levy request. I spoke to the council about this at a public meeting last week. David, I was kind of surprised to see all of these additions, these amendments proposed here. They all passed in the committee meeting last week. The only no vote was the library committee chair, Maritza Rivera, other than Councilmember Juarez, who did join Rivera on a couple of no votes in the minority. But it didn't seem the rest of the council was kind of on board with the chair. It was a little odd to see that.
It feels very Seattle in that we get some kind of acknowledgement of the increasing property tax burden of these levies, which is growing. And We are in an era where everybody is running on an affordability platform, and by definition, this will make things a little less affordable. I don't know that it's the number one factor, but it certainly is a factor. They kind of nod to those concerns and then grow the levy regardless. I think the calculation, though, is a lot of the things that we're talking about in this levy have to do with kind of just basic upkeep in the system. And
Yeah.
if we don't do it now, it's going to be a lot more expensive later to do it.
Yeah.
It helps that voters are almost certainly going to pass this. They
Yeah.
passed the last one with over 70% of the vote.
Right.
You know, you just bring up libraries and people kind of wax poetic and nostalgic about their memories and experiences with the library. It's one of the most beloved institutions run by kind of any government anywhere. And
Yeah, right.
I think the calculation is there's a lot of need here, which is true. And this levy doesn't really even come close to addressing the extent of the particularly maintenance needs for
Not the full
library
need,
system.
Right.
And so, they don't get this chance that often to pass big funding packages. And so their calculation was it's probably going to pass. We need it. Let's do it.
Yeah. And just to point it out to the listeners out there, it is National Poetry Month. So absolutely appropriate, perfectly healthy to wax poetic whenever you need to this month. Just go for it. I did want to get to what this means for the average voter, and I guess the impact this levy has on that levy limit that you reported on and we discussed a few weeks ago on the podcast. There isn't a lot of room left for the city of Seattle to try to pass another levy. I know they still have a lot of needs. Can you talk about that piece of it?
Yeah, for the average voter, I think this particular levy, if it passes, would be about $160 a year. I don't actually know how much of an increase that is from what the current levy is. Mm-hmm. Of course, $160 within the context of a lot of other levies that we're also paying for. The city for a long time, I think, assumed that eventually voters would turn one of these levies down, and that day would come before Seattle got anywhere close to its $3.60 per $1,000 cap.
Yeah.
And so past councils and mayors never really thought about the fact that there was this limit on how many of these levies they could pass, because they assumed either somebody would stop growing them in the future or the voters would reject one.
Right.
Neither has happened. Combined with the fact that property values, particularly commercial property values, did not grow that much over the last few years, and in case of commercial actually decreased in value.
Yeah.
That put the city in this uncomfortable position where if and when this library levy passes, there's room for one more kind of mid-sized levy. That capacity would be taken up pretty quickly if, say, they renew the housing levy at an even greater cost, or they decide that Seattle Center is going to get a levy or whatever it might be. That just kind of forces the mayor and the council to triage in a way that, frankly, they just have not needed to do at all, or have not chosen to do at all over the last 10 years.
Yeah, so interesting to see what happens next. Thank you for that, David, and for all your reporting in the Times about that, too. Well, up next, more economic news for the city of Seattle. Is the city in the midst of a bad year or a good year economically? Even the city's finance committee chair has some questions about that. The story next on Now Hear This. Well, it's that special time of year when the city of Seattle gets its initial revenue projections for budget planning. These happen 3 times a year. And the news is good, maybe not good. I'm putting a question mark there because the budget outlook is essentially unchanged from last year, according to staff from the city's Office of Economic and Revenue Forecast. We learned this late on Friday. So new taxes and maybe an improvement in sales tax revenue, that's on the plus side. But then you have tech layoffs, high oil prices, and inflation in the mix too. So not all city revenue streams are in good shape, says Councilmember Strauss, chair of the Finance Committee.
While we're not losing a lot of money again in a $6 billion plus budget, we're talking about $20 million, $30 million, and possibly only $10 million here. But all of that to say, we should act like this is a bad revenue forecast, please, and I'm glad that it's not worse.
So, David, Councilmember Strauss is saying, and tell me if I have this right, the city doesn't have a pessimistic forecast, as it's called, but it sounds like he's asking his colleagues to treat it like a pessimistic forecast. What's your take on this? What's going on?
My take is that the underlying health of Seattle economy is not great, because Seattle, obviously the sort of economic outlook for the whole nation is a little uncertain and in maybe some choppy waters. Seattle, though, is doing worse than the rest of the country. Inflation is higher. Employment is worse. Last year,
job losses and job growth.
We actually saw, last year we actually saw job loss, a net decline of jobs in the city of Seattle, even as the rest of the country grew. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a very tech heavy city, and tech is really scaling back.
Hmm.
Just the cost of living here is a lot greater. The reason the budget outlook is not bad, or is at least sort of neutral, is frankly just because of new taxes. The city passed a sales tax for public safety last year. They restructured the B&O tax to put more burden on kind of large companies like Amazon. The payroll tax is still the strongest performing revenue source. So it's kind of an interesting situation where the budget looks okay, but it's not really because the economy is going gangbusters. It's because of policies passed by the Seattle City Council to bring in new revenue.
Yeah.
The reason I think maybe that feels a little bit shaky is because the ability of the council and the mayor to continue to do that is in question. How many more of these taxes can or should they be putting on? And then, it's just really not going to take a lot, I think, to tip the city into something more like a legitimate recession.
Yeah.
Some of that is national. The Jan Duras, the chief economist, said,
Yes.
if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for another month, probably the whole country is, it's basically impossible for us to avoid a recession at that point.
Yeah.
But, other things just around what is the effect of new taxes on Amazon? How do they behave with that? What does artificial intelligence mean?
Yeah, right.
There are probably more red flags. Permitting applications for
Sure.
new construction are way down. There are probably more red flags for the Seattle economy than there are green flags, but
Yeah.
because of policies passed by City Hall, it just hasn't really meant that the budget is in at least a worse place than it was before.
Yeah, and I always struggle with this because it seems like there are some things the city can do in terms of incentivizing businesses and things of that nature, but there's not a lot it can do when there are those kind of overbearing, or not overbearing, but just those larger national issues that are at stake. Can you
Right.
talk about that piece of it? Because there's a few avenues that the city can tweak, but they can't take care of. I mean, basically, they can't solve a national economic issue at the local level. Is kind of where I'm going with that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there is an argument that they could do things like roll back the mandatory housing affordability program, and that maybe that would kickstart some new housing construction. And if you get new construction, you get sales tax revenue from that, you get employment from that. I'm sure that the business community would say if you repeal the payroll tax, that would have an effect. I think there's reason to be skeptical about what that would mean for employment, just because of things like AI and larger forces around tech and what's happening there. It might prevent a few jobs from moving to Bellevue. I'm not sure if it would fundamentally change the employment picture for tech sector. So yeah, I mean, I think probably the number one thing they could do is find ways to kind of kickstart the construction economy, because for years, development and real estate sales were really the drivers of the Seattle budget. That's why
you could see all the cranes out there,
you
right?
could see the cranes, and the city hall was really benefiting from that. And now all those cranes are gone. So what can they do to bring that development back? I think office development, I mean, that's its own animal, and who knows what.
Yeah.
If I knew how you could bring back office
luck,
use
yeah.
and development, I would be a rich man. But I think there is an argument that there are some levers they could pull to increase housing development, but I don't know if it's enough to really fundamentally change the state of the economy in Seattle.
Fair. I want to stay on the economic forecast story and talk about the World Cup if I could. We have matches coming to the Emerald City here in June. And David, you wrote about this with your colleague Megan Ululai-Boyanton. It appears those initial reports of economic boosterism connected to the World Cup may have been overstated a little bit. What's going on right now?
Yeah, it's softening. I don't think that should come as a surprise, in part because a lot of these economic projections tend to be a little squishy and hard to fact check. We see it a lot with, new stadiums or new convention centers or big events like this. This is going to bring in trillions and trillions of dollars. It's going to save the city. It's always a little hard to take that stuff at face value. At the same time, it's notable that the people who put out those numbers initially are now pulling back on them. Not hugely, maybe by 10% or so.
Yeah.
I think it's a reflection of the fact that international visitors are probably less likely than they were before. Of course, I think people abroad are maybe less interested or willing to travel to the United States right now.
Yeah.
They're hopeful that what we lose in international travelers will make up for in domestic, but the thinking is people coming from few states over, probably aren't going to stay as long. Maybe
Yeah.
they don't spend as much money. So you might be able to keep up the number of visitors total, but as far as who's going to be spending money here and spending many nights in a hotel room,
Yeah.
they're sort of pulling back on those projections a little bit.
Yeah, and then the international piece that you always take for granted, Canada, just to our north there. I mean, there are matches in Vancouver, and I think that might have an effect too. It's already been a challenge to get Canadian tourists coming over since the Trump administration was talking about making Canada our 51st state, et cetera. Can you talk about that piece too? Because I think that plays a factor here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up. Is to the extent that there has been a real Trump effect on international travel. I think from some countries, the indication is maybe it's not actually as dramatic as some people thought it would be, but it seems to be playing out exactly as some expected it would be from Canada. The numbers, I don't know what they are lately, but for a long time, the numbers kind of fell off a cliff. You saw these stories about Canadian liquor stores taking American booze off their shelves and things like that. And I think there was like real legitimate kind of low-level boycotting of the United States. To your point, though, I think a lot of Canadians, if they want to go see a World Cup match, can go to Vancouver, and they'll probably do that. Which that has been true for a long time, so that's not necessarily a new reality.
Yeah. Last touch on this. I know there are 11 metro areas in the U.S. that are hosting matches. Are they all expecting lower numbers too, or what are you seeing there?
I don't know about all of them. A lot of them, some of them were more conservative to start than Seattle. They never put out as aggressive economic benefit numbers as the city of Seattle did. One argument that Seattle makes for that is, places like San Francisco or whatever, their stadium is way off in the suburbs. You have to drive a great distance to go to a game, whereas Seattle Stadium is,
it's right there,
walking distance of downtown. So, as far as kind of the direct benefit to the city of Seattle, the argument is Seattle's just kind of better positioned to take advantage of that. But, part of the reason that we decided to do this story is because of a story we saw out of New York coming to a probably more dramatic conclusion actually than we did, that the hotel bookings there are just not following the original expectations. I think here it's perhaps not quite as dramatic, and because the initial numbers were more optimistic, there's a little more wiggle room. I'd say though that for the folks who have a lot of eggs in the World Cup basket, particularly hotel workers and kind of more boutique hotels, I wouldn't say it's panic exactly, but some low-level concern about what the kind of current international affairs climate means for Seattle's World Cup.
Fair enough. Well, I'm going to talk about some more concerns here. In fact, big data centers are coming to Seattle, and that has brought on some very big concerns. A look at this story just ahead on What's Next. David, I wanted to draw attention to a story your colleague Greg Kim wrote about recently about 5 large data centers planned to come to Seattle. 4 big tech companies are behind this. They're asking Seattle City Light for this. Don't know the names of those companies just yet. Seattle City Light is keeping that part of it under wraps here. But these companies want to build 5 large-scale data centers with a combined maximum demand of 369 megawatts, roughly 1/3 of what the city uses on an average day. I just wanted to get a bigger picture on this, kind of your take on what this means for the average consumer, because there's a limit at some point as to how much power City Light can produce, right?
Yes. And City Light has been careful to say that, they will have kind of separate agreements with these data centers for what they're paying in rates, because what they really don't want, and they know there is not an appetite for, is those data centers to drive up rates for everyday consumers. So they're hammering that kind of thing out.
Yeah.
I will say I would say it's a little surprising that there may be data centers coming to Seattle of all places rather than maybe more kind of far-flung places. But I think the land rush on data centers is so intense that even the cost of doing business in Seattle is worth it to these companies if they know that they can set up somewhere, because that's just their number one issue at this point. But yes, I think as of, when I looked a few months ago, the expectation was basically over the next 10 years, Seattle's going to have to double its electrical production. It's never had to do that before. This is a utility that has basically been able to run, not autopilot. That sounds like there hasn't been a lot of significant decisions that needed to be made. But as far as where their power was coming from, it was a pretty tried and true formula. It was City Light owns these dams that produce a lot of cheap, pretty clean power. And then where they come up short, they go to Bonneville and buy more power from the Columbia River.
Sure.
That system is not working anymore, really, because the demand for power is skyrocketing. It's skyrocketing up and down the West Coast, which means that the demand for that Bonneville supplementary power is going through the roof. So you're seeing, megawatts at $500 up to $1,000,
Yeah.
which is pretty crazy. And, it's forcing the utility to really think about building new power supplies. I wrote about it last year. I went down to Oregon and saw one of these sites, and as impressive as it was, it's just a tiny drop in the bucket of what they need, and they're going to have a lot of work to do to bring on new power supply.
Yeah, and I guess I'm trying to figure out the math behind it and the economics behind it, because I'm interested to see what comes from these negotiations as City Light is kind of offering contracts to these companies. The companies definitely need power. They're desperate for it. I mean, I wouldn't want to buy land in Seattle for something like that, but how much will they be willing to pay for that? And will those added dollars help out Seattle City Light, which is working to ramp up its power supply? I think that negotiation is going to be really important, because at the end of the day, I guess Seattle City Light could put forth an offer and these companies would say, nah, we're going to look somewhere else. But I don't know, an interesting game within the game there, it feels like.
Which is very much in the realm of possibility. I think a lot more than 5 data centers have approached City Light about some kind of bringing a data center here and then have not followed through on that. I think probably these, at the end of the day, what would push it over is that the data centers need Seattle more than Seattle needs the data centers, because as of right now, again, it used to be, maybe in 2017, it used to be a legitimate question for City Light of whether or not they would be getting enough people buying into their system. It was sort of the opposite problem, because all these buildings were getting so efficient, their ratepayer base was just drying up. That has totally flipped, though. It's now they're just really struggling to keep up with the demand, which means that sure, it would be good financially for them to have these big data centers paying higher rates than just an average resident, but it's kind of not their number one problem right now is revenue from ratepayers.
Yeah, fair enough. David, we do need to wrap up, and I wanted to ask you about this, the unveiling of the Ichiro statue outside T-Mobile Field this past week. Yeah, a few laughs for sure, but of course the bat somehow broke off partially. I wanted to ask you, was that a portent of bad things to come, a reflection of the years of bad luck the Mariners have been through? What did your slightly superstitious baseball brain, if I may, what did that superstitious baseball brain of you think when that happened?
Well, at the time, the Mariners looked horrible and had started their... So I was like, well, of course, their bat would break. And then they rattled off 4 wins against their division rival. So
okay.
I don't know. Maybe I saw some puns around, a clean break.
Ah, yes.
Fast, this is the new Etsy witch of last year, kind of a juju reset kind of thing.
I love it.
I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to see. Yeah, I'm not going to say break all the bats around the field there, but hey, whatever turns it around sounds good to me. Thank you, David, as always. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron, why don't you? Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 per month or more. Thank you a lot for that support there. It's great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might be listening, to the 985 people who have tuned in over the last few years from Columbus, Ohio. I don't quite know what to make of that, but thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.